gathering to attention. Good morning, everyone. How you doing? Good to have everyone here. And I'm just going to take a brief moment to introduce Chris Gehrz this morning, and then I'm going to get out of the way so he can do his thing. One thing I want to make known to everybody, first of all, is that there are books. Chris's book, The Pietist Option, which is the basis of what he's going to be doing for us over the next few weeks, is over here. I strongly encourage you to grab one and read that book. There is an envelope over there. It's an honor system thing. If you want to, do you take checks?
Cash or check.
Cash or check. No cards, sorry. Cash or check. So you can put that in the envelope over there and grab the book. So Chris Gehrz is a professor of history at Bethel University. How long have you been at Bethel?
This will be number 16.
Year number 16.
Wow.
Did his PhD at Yale University and is an expert in the history of Pietism. Has a special relationship to Central through our dear friend Bill Carlson, who Chris was mentored by and worked with at Bethel. And so it's really an honor and really a special treat for us to have Chris here to help us to understand a bit more about our own history as a church, as a denomination, and as a movement in Pietism. So I'm not going to take any more of Chris's time. I'm going to turn it over to him. There are handouts here. If you don't have one of these yet, does anyone not have one? Are there some extras down here? Yeah. Okay, I'll take them in the back for folks coming in. So great, good. So Chris, thank you so much. Let's give him a round of applause. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Joel. I will try to do teacher voice. I've been not teaching for a few months, so I'll see if I can do this. But it's incredibly good to be here. It's fun to come to any church to talk. It's one thing to write a book and just kind of hope that people read it. It's another to actually come talk with people about a book. So it's great to be in any church, but it's especially good to be at this church for reasons that Joel hinted at, and I'll say more about today and in the weeks to come. So the book is called The Pietist Option, so it is back there. It's $20 if you want, or you can save a few dollars if you have Amazon Prime. Just go get it online. But if you want it signed, it's probably better to get it here today. So Joel said that I'm an expert in the history of Pietism, so let me start by explaining why that's not totally true. I feel like anytime I give a talk like this, I have to explain, I don't think expert is right. I did not train in Pietism. I trained in diplomatic and military history. And that's what I came to Bethel to teach, in European history and things like that. I never took a religious history class. Unlike Joel, I don't have a seminary degree. So I always feel like I need to explain why I'm here and why you should take anything I say seriously, because it's not coming from training or expertise. And to further humble myself, let me show you the very first picture of me in the Bethel Clarion, which is not only a bad picture and suggests that until I met my wife, I didn't know how to dress myself with glasses. But as usual, I misspelled my last name, which is good. So I came to Bethel in 2003 to teach European history. And I came with a little bit of trepidation. I did not have a Christian college background. I'm not a Bethel grad or a Northwestern grad. I grew up here, but I wanted to go east, and I wanted to go to big, well-known schools. I went to William & Mary for college and Yale for grad school, and then I came back here. And honestly, I was more excited about coming back to Minnesota, I think, than coming to Bethel per se, or to a Christian college. It was coming home. But I was interested in the idea of doing something where my faith and my scholarship and my teaching could work together. But I was a little nervous about coming to a Baptist school. I'm not a Baptist. I had spent 10 years going to Baptist churches out east, but it had been a kind of mixed experience. I mean, I appreciated the Baptist commitment to the authority of Scripture and to things like soul freedom and to missions and evangelism, but the Baptist churches I had known were combative and suspicious of the world, and 3 of them split while I was there, right? Like, that was my experience of Baptist. But I came to Bethel, and like right off the bat from the interview, I had this very strong sense of this is a different kind of place. They share that same commitment to Scripture and evangelism and missions and this individual encounter with Christ, but they weren't combative, and they didn't seem to want to split, and they seemed to have a very different kind of posture towards the world around them. I didn't understand it, and so I went across the hall to my hallmate, G.W. Carlson. And he became kind of my mentor in Bethel, first of all, and he said, well, it's because of pietism. And I said, that's great, what is pietism? Now, I've grown up in the Covenant Church, which is actually often describes itself as pietistic, but when you're like a 16-year-old confirmation student, you don't pay attention to such nuances, so I had no idea what that meant. And so for 3 years, I felt like I was being mentored by GW. Now, I was going to grow out a GW-like beard over the summer for you, but my wife vetoed that proposal, so instead, I'll give you a beardless picture of GW. This is the first picture of GW from the Bethel Yearbook after he became a faculty member in 1968. So this is GW with, I think this is Dwight Jessup, as an advisor to the Political Science Club on campus. And of course, he stayed for more than 40 years, and he kind of took me under his wing and explained not only things like what it means to be a teacher and an advisor, professor, but what it means to be a pietist, or I mean, his formulation, Swedish Baptist pietist. And I'm Swedish and I'm pietist, I'm not Baptist, but I could play along. And it really was an education, and it became a really fruitful partnership. In 2009, two of us with Christian Collins Wynn, a colleague of ours, hosted an international conference at Bethel that led to this book, The Pietist Impulse in Christianity. You can find this in the seminary library. This was carved by Dale Johnson in the art department for Carl Lundquist, former president of Bethel, who founded the Evangelical Order of the Burning Heart. So this is Luke 24, the Emmaus Road, where our hearts burning within us as Jesus read and taught to us. And so this is where I learned what pietism meant. And I will no doubt quote GW today. I'll quote him a couple other times because he is, in many ways, my source of what pietism means. And then to that, I've added some others. And I did another book about education based on this, but I always felt bad when people would tell me they had bought a copy of one of these books because they were very academic in tone. I didn't think they were especially useful for anyone if you weren't like in a college like Bethel. And so on my last sabbatical, I worked with my pastor, Mark Patty, at Salem Covenant Church in New Brighton, and we decided to try to write a relatively short, like 120-page introduction to what pietism is, not as history, but what would this look like today, in the year 2018, in a church like Salem or Central Baptist, and that's the option. So that's mostly what I'll talk about as we go through our 4 weeks. But I think we do need to do a little bit of history to explain where this comes from. So this is your timeline if you want to fill it in. I found sometimes it's helpful to give something for people to write. And I'll try not to take too long. I'll also try not to rush. But I do want to give you a little bit of a sense of where this all comes from before we think about where we're headed with it. So we start in Germany. So there's no Germany. That doesn't happen for another 260 years. But in the German-speaking lands of Europe. And in 1610, there's a Lutheran pastor named Johann Arndt, who's a kind of mystical figure, kind of gets exiled because the church doesn't like him very much. And he writes a book called True Christianity, or Actual or Authentic Christianity, to be a translation. Which might seem like an odd thing for a German Christian to write in 1610. I mean, Germany has been Christian for centuries at this point. 99% of the population, if you would ask them, would have said, I'm a Christian. You know, Lutheran, Reformed, Catholic, maybe a few Anabaptists. You know, Christians are everywhere. Churches are everywhere. They're powerful and they're wealthy and they've got influence over politics and society and economics. They run the universities. But Arndt thinks that it's a kind of imitation of Christianity. It's people going through the motions of Christianity. People using the name of Christianity but not having any substance, any vitality. It's kind of hollow Christianity. And so he starts thinking, well, but what does it really mean to follow Christ? So that's kind of lingering in the background. This isn't pietism yet, but this will be very influential because 8 years later, something happens in this part of the world that causes people to entertain serious doubts about these churches and about what we've been calling Christianity. Germany erupts into a civil war that lasts for 30 years. It's called the 30 Years' War. It kills at least 20, perhaps 25 or 30% of the population. Until we get to the 20th century and the world wars, it's by far the bloodiest conflict in European history, and it's Christians killing Christians. Now, it's not only about religion, it's about all sorts of complicated political issues, but at the core are these lingering disputes from the Reformation about communion and baptism and the nature of the priesthood and the church and authority. And it's terrible. And it finally ends in 1648. And it leaves behind, I think, a society we would recognize. a society that's deeply shaken. It's doing okay, but there's a lot of economic uncertainty. And most importantly, there's a great deal of political polarization and social division. People live together, they're not killing each other anymore, but they don't trust their neighbors. And most importantly, religion is splintered. You've got lots of different churches, and they all want to make very clear what they teach, because that is the right way of doing Christianity, and everything else is not right. It's a divided, troubled society. And society where I think there's not a great deal of hope. There's a lot of uncertainty of what does this mean? Why has God allowed this to happen? Where are we headed? And one of the people living through this is this man right here. His name is Philip Jakob Spener. So I'll get to his book in a sec, but let me tell you his backstory. So Spener is born on the border between France and Germany, in a place called Alsace, in 1635, right in the middle of the 30 Years' War. And France participates in this war, and so Spener is literally watching this war happen as armies march across the borders. And he has relatives who have been affected by this war. He goes to university in Strasbourg, gets his doctorate, goes down to Geneva, studies with the Calvinists for a while, and then at age 31, his first appointment as pastor is to be the chief preacher of the large city of Frankfurt. I mean, he's a rising star. And he gets to Frankfurt, and it should be kind of the early pinnacle to his career, but instead, he kind of finds a dismal situation. He preaches all the time, there are churches everywhere, and he says there is no life here. Instead, what he calls dead orthodoxy. The right things are being taught, but there's nothing to them. I mean, they're words, right? But they don't shape the heart, and they don't lead to changed behavior in terms of individual behavior, but also he's thinking, what does this mean for society? What is the church supposed to do in politics and economics and education, right? And so he's looking for ways to bring about what we would probably call a revival, a renewal of some sort. And the first thing he does might seem very humble to us. In 1670, a couple of his parishioners, including a lawyer, asked him, it's great that we worship on Sundays, but could we meet outside of Sunday morning for Bible study? Martin Luther had talked about this early in the Reformation, and then it kind of got lost, but Spener said, okay, I'll meet with you on Sunday afternoon or Wednesday morning. And he started meeting outside of formal worship to study the Bible, to read Luther, and to sing hymns together. And we just take small groups for granted, right? I mean, almost every church has something like this. This was a revolutionary development because it meant that lay people were as important as the clergy. It's not just Spener's job to stand up there towering above a congregation and preaching, like he wanted to be in the Word with people, and through that he thought this will start transforming individuals. And if individuals are transformed, the church will be transformed. And if the church is transformed, maybe the world can be transformed. And so it's a very humble beginning, but it leads to ripple effects. But they're hard to control. One of the people who's part of this group is a brilliant woman named Johanna Eleanor Peterson. And she's an amazing person. She ends up teaching Greek and Hebrew to girls. She actually preaches occasionally at a time when women certainly did not preach. But she also splits with Spener because she reads the Bible and comes to more radical conclusions than Spener does. So we'll probably come back to that later. Anyway, in 1675, Spener's pretty well known, and he's asked to publish an introduction to a collection of sermons by Ernst, a friend. Spener has read True Christianity. He has kind of the same idea, like, could we find more authentic faith? And so he says, okay, now I can kind of talk about what's the problem? Why do we need to listen to Ernst, and how are we going to fix things? And the introduction he writes is about 100 pages long, and it becomes so popular that it's published in its own right as a book called Pietist Option, Pious Wishes, or Pious Aspirations. And what it means is that in the book he says, here are 6 concrete steps we should take if we want to renew the church. And so we'll talk about those in the next 3 weeks. We'll kind of take 2 at a time and work through them. Undergirding all of this is Spener's insistence that we can have hope for better times. That God did not mean individuals, the church, or the world to linger in division, in uncertainty, and doubt. But God means better times for all of us. And it's a profoundly hopeful vision of Christianity, and it's inspiring. And his opponents say, oh, you're holier than everyone else. You're more pious. We'll call you pietists, right, out of the Pieta. But this catches on, and you start getting small groups across Germany, and this is republished. And one of the most important early followers of Spener is a brilliant young scholar named August Hermann Franke, or AH works too, if you want to shorten. So Franke is a little bit different. Spener never really has like a conversion experience. He doesn't have like that kind of like time and place. Here's where I had my Damascus Road encounter. Franke does. Franke, and he writes about it, it's a deeply emotional, it's years of kind of doubt and confession, and finally he falls to his knees and he's transformed, and he goes forth, and he's really the organizer of pietism. He is the builder. He is the kind of creative genius. Spener is kind of the intellectual forefather. Hermann Franke starts building things. He's appointed to be a professor at a new university in Halle, and he's a pastor as well. But he wants to do more than just teach and preach. He founds an orphanage. He founds a series of schools for boys and girls of all social classes. He built a scholarship fund so that the poor can send their kids to school as well. He reforms the university. He founds a pharmacy. And he founds a publishing house. And in the 18th century, they print about 3 million inexpensive New Testaments that they spread all over the world. And they send missionaries. In 1706, 2 pietist pastors from Halle go to a Danish colony in India, Tranquebar, or Taramgambadi. And to this day, there are about 200,000 Tamil-speaking Lutherans because of this very early Protestant missionary effort sent out from Halle. So this actually is what builds pietism. It's not just a book, it's not just a small group, it's really like this kind of movement, not just to reform, but to go forth, right, to evangelize and to reform society. So that's one strand. At the same time, not too far from Halle, there's an estate called Herrnhut, the Lord's Watch. It belongs to Spener's godson, Nicolaus Zinzendorf. And Zinzendorf welcomes a group of religious refugees to his estate from Moravia. So this is now the Czech Republic. So that's an old group. Their origins go back to the 1400s. And on his estate, they found a new kind of colony. And in 1727, they have a revival. And they call it Moravian Pentecost. And from this, all sorts of interesting things happen. They establish, Herrnhut is the Lord's Watch. They pray around the clock for 100 years. Inaugurate a kind of prayer. And partly what they're praying for is missions. Because the Moravians send missionaries not just to India, but to places like Labrador and the Caribbean and to the British colony of Georgia in North America. And they get converts. One I should have put on here, I'll put on a different reading list, is a woman named Rebecca, who was a slave on a Dutch island. And she converts, and she actually becomes a missionary in her own right. She marries a German Moravian, she goes to Germany, she preaches there, she comes back to the Caribbean. She actually dies in West Africa preaching to slave traders at the fortress of Christiansborg. And if you're interested, pick up a book called Rebecca's Revival by John Sensbach. And I'll put that on a subsequent reading list. Their other most famous kind of convert is a frustrated Anglican missionary from England named John Wesley. John Wesley has kind of hinted in this direction. He's been part of a holy club with a guy named George Whitefield back in Oxford. He goes to Georgia. He's not making much headway, but he meets the Moravians. And he's inspired by not just their commitment to missions, but their kind of calm confidence. And he goes back to London. In 1738, he goes to St. Paul's Cathedral in the morning, a good high church Anglican service, and then in the evening, he goes up the street of Aldersgate to a Moravian Bible study. And in the middle of that, he has what he calls his conversion experience. And he writes in his journal that my heart was strangely warmed. And it's the beginning of the Methodist movement, which is a huge part of the First Great Awakening. So I mentioned that part because this gets us a little closer to at least the tradition of this church and to Sweden. So Pietists have been going north to Sweden for a long time. And the Moravians will send missionaries to Sweden as well. But a year before Moravian Pentecost, in 1726, the Kingdom of Sweden banned conventicles, small groups. This is a state church, and they did not like the idea that ordinary Swedes would gather outside the presence of clergy in the state church in order to study the Bible by themselves. And so it was against the law for about 130 years in Sweden to do small groups independently. So it keeps happening kind of under the surface, but this Pietism is kind of burgeoning and finally breaks out in the 1830s. A Methodist missionary named George Scott comes to Stockholm to minister to British workers in the new factories. And while he's there, he starts preaching to Swedes too. Now he gets himself kicked out of Sweden. He goes on a fundraising trip to New York, and to try to play on the heartstrings of American Christians, he makes Sweden sound terrible. And which I don't think was really true. He gets money, but it also makes the Swedes really upset and they kick him out. But he leaves behind a movement, and he kind of hands off leadership to a Swedish Christian named Karl Olaf Rosenius. He was a journalist and a lay preacher. He's never ordained, but he preaches in Bethlehem Church in Stockholm. And he edits a magazine or a newsletter called Pietist, the Pietist. Now, if you had asked Rosenius, he would have said he's a Lutheran Christian. I mean, he doesn't think he's doing anything new, but it's Lutheranism by way of Pietism. And he goes back to Spener and to Franca and to the Moravians, and this becomes an enormous revival that reshapes Christianity in Sweden. And it goes in lots of different directions. So, for example, one of Rosenius' friends is a Lutheran pastor named Anders Weiberg, who decides, after studying scripture, that actually infants ought not to be baptized. It should be a conscious adult choice. He has to leave the Lutheran church over this. And so out of this pietistic revival, you get the first Swedish Baptists. So I have a feeling a few of you here can tell us more about Echo Nilsson than I can. But one of the kind of key moments here is one of these kind of Swedish pietists is a man named Echo Nilsson, and while he's in Germany, he encounters Baptist churches. And in Hamburg, he's baptized in the river. And he'll go on to be a key leader of Baptists, not just in Sweden, but in America. Because this is also the beginning of the great age of Swedish immigration. Between 1850 and 1930, 1.25 million Swedes leave Sweden and head to Canada and the United States. And that includes the Baptists. So in 1852, the first Swedish Baptist church is planted in Illinois under Gustav Palmberg. A year later, Nilsson arrives and plants a church, I think, in Houston, Minnesota, and I think Carlson can tell us more. And eventually they need pastors, and so in 1871, a former sailor named John Alexis Edgren founds a Swedish Baptist seminary in Chicago, famously with 2 professors and 1 student in the wake of a great fire, and this grows into Bethel University many years later. So here, autobiography can start to intersect with history. This is the origin of your denomination. I mean, it's harder to tell now with the new name, but Swedish Baptists are different than some of the other Baptist traditions in America. They have some things in common with them, but they came out of a pietistic revival in Sweden. And even though the Converge has become much more diverse, right, and it's got many more influences, there's always been this kind of different strand woven in that you don't see with Southern Baptists and American Baptists and Fundamentalist Baptists. Some of those old pietistic impulses have always been here. And sometimes they're kind of hidden, sometimes they burst forth, but I think that's what I noticed, right? That's why I came to a Baptist university that seemed different than my parents' Southern Baptist church, and the Reformed Baptist church I'd gone to in New Haven, and the other Baptist churches I've been to. Now, I should add, I'm not Baptist, so my story here is that 4 years after John Alexis Edgren plants his seminary, a farmer from Dalsland named A.P. Peterson joins the great diaspora. And he plants a farm in western Wisconsin, and there's a Lutheran church, but he doesn't go to the Lutheran church. Instead, he goes to Bethel Mission Covenant Church in rural Pierce County, Wisconsin. A.P. Peterson was my great-great-grandfather. So you've had other pietists coming over, and they're Lutheran in theology, but they don't necessarily want to be part of a church that values creeds and confessions. And in 1885, they organized as what they call the Mission Covenant. They call themselves Mission Friends. And so to this day, we Covenanters sometimes use this language and say we are mission friends. So the subtitle of this course is Some Advice from a Mission Friend. Because in many ways, we're cousin traditions. GW always called me a dry Baptist, right? I hadn't quite gone far enough. But in many ways, we're coming out of the same soil. We have some of the same kind of concerns and emphases. And so it's really fun to be here at a Swedish Conference Baptist Church as a Covenanter myself. Okay, so that's enough history. Try to leave us hosts. Okay, we have time. So we have like 30 minutes now to explain. So what makes this pietism? Why is this pietism, besides that I told you it's pietism? What does this have in common? And one thing that I found very helpful is a distinction from Roger Olson, who taught at Bethel for a long time. He's at Truett Seminary in Baylor now. The first book that I recommend to you, if you want to learn more about the history, is the book he did with Christian Collins Wynn called Reclaiming Pietism. It's serious, 200 pages, but I think it's pretty accessible. Roger said that there are two ways of thinking about pietism. There's pietism as a movement, Spener, Franke, Zinzendorf, this kind of organized thing that happened in Germany at a certain time, but that kind of died out. If you go to Germany, you will not find a pietist church anymore. Some of the residue is there, but the movement died basically when Franke died, and when Zinzendorf kind of moved on to other things. So the movement is just history, and you might find that interesting, but it's not super relevant today. But Roger says there's something else. Pietism is also what he called an ethos, or a spirit. It's a set of impulses, or concerns, or emphases, and they can show up in lots of different places. For example, Sweden in the 19th century, or the American Midwest in the time of immigration, or the Caribbean, the Moravians, or it shows up in Anabaptist history, or other kinds of history. And so as we wrote our book, and we tried to think, well, how do we define what pietism is? Because it's not just this kind of stale, musty, German-speaking history. We thought, well, let's think about it in terms of instincts. We're not purely rational creatures, right? We come to a situation in a church or anywhere else, and we have instincts of here's what we're supposed to do, here's what we're supposed to think, here's how we feel at a gut level about something. And it struck me that I think pietism is oriented around at least 4 instincts. And these are not always right. Like, these can take you in very dangerous directions. And sometimes they actually are in conflict with each other, but that's what people are like, right? We're a mess of contradictory instincts. And I think pietism has at least 4. So in our remaining 25 minutes or so, I want to walk you through the 4 instincts, kind of explain how we define them in the book. If you're interested, you can pick up a copy and read more. And then I want to attach it more to the history of this church and its denomination in Bethel, and kind of give you a sense of how do those instincts show up in the history of this kind of Swedish Baptist movement that gives you the church you have today. And then I'll close by sharing a little bit of covenant history to kind of speak from the cousin tradition. So, instinct number 1. So this is page 2 of your handout. I'll let you see if you can guess who the person is who says each of these things. So I'm going to shift the order from the book a little bit and start with this confusing. So I would say, and again, it could be wrong, you might not share this, but this is, I think, a pietist instinct, that there is less to Christianity than we think. There's also more to Christianity than we think. Now, part of this is the word think. I'll get to that in a second. But partly what this is nudging us towards is maybe Christianity is not mostly about how we think about the world, it's about feeling and action. So we'll come to that in instinct number 2. But less than. So I think the first thing here is to say that as pietists, whether it's Spener in the 18th and 17th century, or Franke in the 18th, or GW in the 21st, we look at what we call Christianity, what we call churches, and we say, maybe we've made it too complicated, too messy, there's too much stuff there. Maybe we have way too long a list of doctrines and say that if you don't affirm all those doctrines, you're not really a Christian. Maybe we need to simplify that. So my denomination has 6 affirmations, and the 6th one is we'll just disagree about what's past the other. It's more complicated than that, but that's how it's done it. But maybe it's also that we get too hung up on things like organization and institutions, building a kind of system and having the right kind of way of doing things and having buildings and budgets. And maybe there's a kind of simplifying impulse that we need to say, at the end of the day, there's something far simpler, more meaningful than all. Not that you don't need that. Like I was on a leadership team, I ran a budget for a long time. You need budgets to make churches work, to pay people like Joel, to keep the air conditioning going, right? But maybe we get too caught up with that, because that can tempt us into using the wrong standards to judge how a church is doing. That can tempt us into thinking, well, you're a successful church if you're a wealthy church. You're a successful church if you got enough numbers for a church. You're a successful church if you have enough influence, right? And those can be good things, and God can work through those things, but they can also lead us into confusing the values of the world with the values of Christ and His church. And so I think pietism has that kind of concern that, we need those institutions and structures and lists of beliefs, but they can pull us away from that true Christianity that Arndt was talking about. At the same time, maybe we sell Christianity short, following Jesus short. Maybe it can lead to something much deeper, much more extensive than just, I go to church on Sundays, I'm a member of this church, maybe it can transform lives. We're accustomed, for example, to the idea that part of Christianity is a new birth or a rebirth. Right? we look at John chapter 3 and we say, well, of course, but not all Christians read John chapter 3 that way. I went to a Lutheran sermon once where it came to completely the opposite conclusion. What you need to do is be baptized, right? And that is infants, right? And that is what Jesus is talking about. Pietists read that very differently. They're the first to talk about the new birth. Luther doesn't talk about this very much. And the new life, that something happens as impossible as being born again. And it changes your life, and it changes how you feel and how you think, and most importantly, how you behave and how you treat other people. And so maybe there's more to Christianity than we expect. Maybe it's become, it's comfortable. Christians maybe are a little bit different than everyone else. Maybe Christians can be a lot different. So, let me give you a Swedish Baptist version of this. So in 1955, a Bethel professor wrote this. Pietism seemed to be the breath of God moving among the dry bones. This is Ezekiel, right? The valley of dry bones. Bringing life to the various valleys of buried skeletons of theology or religious formalism. So he's talking about the 17th century. He's talking about Schwiemer. And you kind of heard a version from this. I sketched this pretty dismal portrait of what Christianity was like in Germany in the 17th century. And then Pietism shows up and breathes new life into those dry bones. So this is Virgil Olson. So Virgil Olson becomes church history chair at Bethel Seminary in the mid-1950s, which is when he's writing this. And he inherits this position from his father, Adolf Olson, who had been the church historian of the Baptist General Conference. So the first thing to say here is that up until Adolf and Virgil Olson, Swedish Baptists told their story very differently than the way I told it to you. If you read the very first histories of these Baptists, they don't talk about Pietism at all. They say a little bit about the Anabaptists in the 16th century, and then they'll talk about English Baptists and German Baptists, and then boom, Swedes are Baptists. But Adolf Olson, when he writes his anniversary history of these people, he says, no, there's this pietistic revival going on in Sweden. And Virgil inherits this idea. So he writes an article for the Seminary Quarterly in 1955, in which he explains why Swedish Baptists are pietists and what's distinctive of them. And my favorite line, I think I quoted this in every book I've ever written, is this. Pietism will always arise in reaction against a superficial Christianity, whether it be found in rotting formalism, a thinned-out evangelism, or a misfired scholasticism, or anything else that has the form of piety and lacks the power thereof. And it's an idea Rosanius would like. Rosanius writes an article where he says, what you've got are two kinds of Christianity, pietism and formal Christianity. The forms. If we ever say like going through the motions, this is what you mean. Like it looks like Christianity, it sounds like Christianity, it's got a bulletin, it's got a liturgy, but it's really not. And that's the rotting part. It's a hollow, it's a shell. There's nothing inside. Or a thinned-out evangelism. People talk about it, but there's no depth to it. There's no substance to it. A misfired scholasticism. It's a very heady, intellectual, really interesting theology, but there's no life at the core of it. It doesn't touch the heart anyway. But what I like about this, and this gets at the ethos idea, is it means that pietism doesn't have to be a movement. It doesn't have to be a denomination or something. It's a response. If we ever feel ourselves getting kind of hollowed out, pietism will those instincts will flicker up and they'll start a renewal. Pietism is kind of always lingering there, and at certain times, maybe it's going to rise up in importance because we realize we've got away from what we're supposed to be. So again, you can disagree with this, but this is a pretty powerful idea to introduce, and it gives Swedish Baptists a different way of thinking about who they are and why their movement started and what they're supposed to do in the 1950s and maybe here in the 2010s. So Christianity is less than we think, but it's also much more than we think. It can bring life to dry bones. Okay, so that's the first instinct. Second instinct. So this is actually the one that I started with, because what I did when I got interested in pietism, I didn't go back to Schwiemer and Franke or Sweden in the 19th century. I was interested in this in terms of what it meant for Bethel, for higher education. How would pietism reshape how you do a Christian college? And so, as I researched that, what really struck me is that my primary research subject seemed to think that maybe it was not primarily about the head. It seems odd. Higher education should be intellectual, if nothing else, and he thought it was. But he thought it was actually about more than just the head. It was about the heart, and the hands, and the feet. After he retired, he wrote this. Truth is personal as well as propositional. Truth, in fact, is troth. Pledge you my troth, an old Victorian way of talking about love. A way of loving. And truth is motivated not only by curiosity and the desire to be in control, but by compassion. And so that was in the back of my mind when we were writing the book. And I suggested this as an instinct, that we know God more through prepositions than propositions. So what I meant here was, in some ways, when we talk about God, we use propositions. God is Trinity, right, for Christians. He is one, but he is three. Jesus is the Son of God, the Savior, our Lord, fully human, fully divine. And those are important ideas, right? We need those ideas, or else we don't know how to think about God, we don't know how to talk about God. And so we need the propositions. But they can't be all we need. We need more than propositions. It is not enough just to have an abstract idea of God. An atheist can have an abstract idea of God. A skeptic can have an abstract idea of God. I think for a Christian, we need something beyond a proposition. We need a preposition. So in any language, what is a preposition? I'll give an example, like English quiz time. What are some prepositions?
By, for, from.
Yeah, by, for, from, of, in, right? So like in my tradition, the Covenant Church, we talk all the time about life in Christ. And we ask, how goes your walk with Christ? And we say that the church is built under Christ or on Christ. In the book I mentioned, there's a nice little book by John Stott, the great British evangelical, in which every chapter is about a preposition. And he pulls out a preposition from Scripture that talks about how we relate to God. So prepositions are how we relate to God, what our relationship is like with Christ, how the church relates to Christ. And I think this is a way of getting at this notion that truth, even, these ideas are about love. That at the end of the day, it's not just enough to kind of think about this distant sort of idea of God, but to seek to be in relationship with God and then with each other and with the world. So, does anyone know who wrote this, by the way? It was 1986 that this was. Okay.
Propositions have objects.
That's true. Propositions of objects. This is not a subject. Does anyone know the source of this quote here? I would be very surprised if you did. But you probably know who it is. So this is Carl Lundquist. So if you didn't go to Bethel, Carl Lundquist was president from 1954 until 1982. He was a Bethel grad himself, pastor in a few places. He was in Chicago when he was called to be president of Bethel College and Seminary. So in many ways, the most important president Bethel had. He oversaw its growth. It doubled twice under him. It moved from the campus across the State Fairgrounds to the present campus in Arden Hills. After he left, he retired and founded this kind of a Christian spirituality movement called the Evangelical Order of the Burning Heart. He wrote a newsletter, and that's where that truth is trough idea comes from. So he has been my main research subject. And between him and Virgil Olson, I think you can see something happening with the Baptist General Conference in the 1950s and 60s. And it's very similar to what happened in my denomination. First of all, it stopped being Swedish. It was no longer just immigrants. It wasn't spectacularly diverse, but at least European Americans of other origins came in, and then other Americans came in, which was great, and there was growth, and it enriched their lives in many ways, but it also meant you didn't have that old kind of ethnic glue holding everything together. You couldn't just assume everyone was a Swede, even though, say, at Salem, we sometimes make that assumption sometimes. And so what makes us different? Because in many ways, like Lundquist is an evangelical. He actually becomes president of the National Association of Evangelicals in the 1970s. He's part of world evangelism movements. And he likes that, he values that, but he knows that these Baptists are not like other Baptists, and these evangelicals are not like other evangelicals. And so people like him and Virgil Olson say, well, part of this is pietism. And as he thinks about Bethel, he will appeal to this and say there's something a little different here that makes us not quite like Wheaton, or Biola, or Gordon, or St. Olaf, or St. Thomas, for that matter. And it's, I think, mostly, not solely, but mostly pietism. So he writes about this in a series of annual reports to the denomination. And my favorite one comes from 1959. It's his clearest attempt to say, here's what makes Bethel a Christian college. And the most important claim, which kind of leaps out at you, is this. That the unifying center of the academic program is neither truth nor the pursuit of truth, but is Jesus Christ himself. Now, that's shocking because most American colleges at this point are shedding religion. Right? They were founded, my alma mater, Yale, was founded by conservative Congregationalists who thought Harvard was too secular. While I was at Yale, they got rid of Christian chaplains altogether. Right? So just to say that Jesus Christ is at the center of an American higher education enterprise, that's pretty radical by itself. But notice he also says the truth is not. It's important, obviously. That's why we teach history classes and theology classes and chemistry classes. But there's something deeper than truth. There's a person at the center of this. Ultimately, in our Christian view, truth and Christ are one. And the important thing about truth is that it ought to point to Christ. Why do you study not just theology? Why do you study history or sociology? Why do you study biology or mathematics? It points you to the one who is the way, the truth, and the life. The Word, through whom all came into being. It's an amazing claim. That if we study anything, in a way, it pulls us into relationship with Christ. This was a transformative moment. I remember reading this for the first time, and I've never stopped thinking about it. And I often tell my students, it is not in the syllabus, because it's not a measurable, assessable outcome, but the single most important thing that I hope happens in any class you take is that you will encounter Jesus in some way. And I can't even tell you how that's going to happen. It might be a relationship with another person, it might be a story you hear. Oddly for me, because I teach the 20th century, often I feel like it's during the Holocaust. You're encountering him in suffering, and questioning, where is God? Why have you forsaken us? And that might lead you to Christ. But that means it's not just about a proposition. This is not Christ an idea. This is not Christ a painting on a wall. This is Christ a person, fully human, fully divine, in whom we live and move and have our being. And that's true of a college as much as it is as a church. It's a hard thing to do in a college because we're also an academic institution, but I think that's a pretty central pietist sort of instinct, is to say this is mostly about relating to God. It's not enough just to kind of have an idea of God in your head and say the words of your mouth. There's to be something deeper that encompasses the whole person. Okay. The number 3. Because so far, it's been very individualistic, right? Your relationship to God, you can be born again, you can be transformed, but that's not enough. And that's where pietists often get into trouble. Just feel like, well, it's just about you. You can kind of retreat from the world. Some of them even kind of split off from other churches, do their own thing. The other impulse that I value, going back to Spener, is the idea that Christians are better together. That when Jesus is praying his high priestly prayer in John 17, he says that he prays for his disciples and those who come to faith through those disciples. So every one of you, may they be one as you and I are one. And I don't ever stop reflecting on this, right? Is it possible that the church will have a community as intimate as the community of the Trinity between Father and Son? Is that actually possible? Because it seems impossible. You study any church history and you'll find a lot of counter evidence to that. But Paul says this in almost every epistle. He will talk about Christian unity at some point. And in some of them, it's the central concern. You are fighting and you should be one. You are splitting and you should be united. And it's impossible. It will never fully happen. But I think pietists have wanted to say, and we'll do more of this in about 2 weeks, that this is really important. And even if it's not always going to work out, we always should be trying to make it work out. So Spener is saying this in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War, which Christians are literally killing each other in the hundreds of thousands. And even after the killing is done, spiritually they think that they're each dead. They think they're all heretics. And Spener is saying, no, maybe we can even get back to the point of the early church. Maybe we can have at least that, the early church fought too, right? But maybe even get back to that much. At the very least, Spener said, we should avoid unnecessary controversy and angry polemics. Maybe we enjoy arguing with each other too much. Maybe we think so much of our own opinion, we don't think there's something right in the other person's opinion. So here's a Bethel example of that. This is from 1994. The irenic spirit became part of the Baptist General Conference tradition It helps us to understand the manner in which theological disputes are conducted on campus and a willingness to dialogue with various members of the Baptist community. So when I came to Bethel, right off the bat, I think I heard Jay talk about the irenic spirit, and I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. I'd never even heard the word irenic before, and it turns out it's Greek for peaceable. And Jay insisted there's something different about Bethel. It's not that we don't argue, it's not that we don't have differences of opinion, but the way we do it is in a peaceable spirit. We mean peace to each other. We do not seek division, we do not seek anger, we do not seek permanent separation from each other. We do everything, even arguments, in the hope of reconciliation and peace. And the author of this, I'm sure, would have been very glad to hear that his provost was telling a new fact. Remember this, because this was GW. That was GW in 1994. So GW had been on campus since 1968. But I think in the late 80s and early 90s, Bethel in some ways was growing again after a crisis period, but it was growing by trying to become more broadly evangelical, trying to reach out beyond kind of founding churches, which is good. Like, we wouldn't survive if that didn't happen, but the danger of that is you start forgetting what makes you distinctive, as GW thought so. In 1994, he gave a talk in which he insisted, no, we are a Swedish Baptist Pietist university. And I would have given you the link, but it's behind a firewall at Bethel, but if you want, I can print it out for you. And so he was thinking, well, what is different about us? What makes us unlike Wheaton and Taylor and Westmont and all these other schools we compare ourselves to? And so we'll talk more about the different things he said, but one thing he said is we have this irenic spirit. This kind of peaceable way of relating to each other, even as we're Baptists. And he went on to say this. In 2002, the Pietist principle for theological inquiry was in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, in all things charity. The Pietists rejected state coercion of religious belief and an overemphasis on details of doctrine by theologians and church leaders. So this was the first issue of what he called the Baptist Pietist Clarion. I put a few of those articles on your suggested reading list. It all still lives online to this day. So this is coming out of the open theism debate in your denomination and at Bethel. So I want to come back to the first line. The second line gives you the first two instincts. Pietists reject state coercion. They reject the idea that what we need is a powerful state church that either directly or indirectly forces people to act like Christians. And instead, they want an authentic, freely given expression of faith. Okay? So that's the less than and more than Christianity we're thinking about. Pietists reject overemphasis on details of doctrine. If this is really about a relationship to God, maybe we get too caught up on the propositions. We get too hung up on relatively minor theological matters, and that causes division within the church. Not to say theology should not be done, and not to say we won't disagree, but maybe we could have something like this formula, which is not a Pietist formula. It's a very old formula in Christianity. There are certain essentials on which we ought to have unity. But we've got to figure out which those are, and maybe it's a pretty short list. Past that, there's some non-essential things in which we ought to give liberty to each other. And you cannot tell someone else, here's what you have to believe. And that's a very Pietist, or Baptist and Pietist idea. And then all things, we have to do things with the spirit of charity or love, really, is what it means. But even if at the end of the day you do disagree, you do separate, you still are obligated to love your neighbors and your enemies. So we'll work this out a lot more in a couple of weeks. This is proposal number 4 of Speaker that we'll be thinking about. But this is one of many things I took away from GW. So, Christianity is less than and more than we think. We encounter God more through prepositions than propositions, and we're better together. And, that's all so that we can do the mission of God. I haven't even talked about that. I can talk about evangelism or education, missions, social justice. That's all part of it too. We'll come to that as we go along. But if you're like me, you've spent your life in the church, or if you've spent even a month in the church, you know that it often fails, that we do all these things badly, the mission never goes like what we think it is, programs never work out as well as we think they do. Doing church can be a very dispiriting kind of thing to do. It can be very frustrating. We blame each other, we blame the world, everyone but ourselves often, at least I do. And so I'll leave you with the 4th instinct. Because at the end of the day, I think it's actually the most important instinct. And here I'm going to draw on my tradition a little bit. And it's Spinner's instinct. We always have hope for better times. Whatever else they are, Christians are hopeful people. So haven't signed a lot of copies of the book. I don't really know how to sign books well, but I always put down 1 Corinthians 15 and 58. Because 1 Corinthians 15 is Paul's description of the resurrection, which, as I think about more and more, really is, to me, central doctrine. And what struck me is that Pietists don't just believe in the idea of the resurrection, but they want to live as if they believe in the resurrection. And Paul says that if you do that, in Christ, your labor is not in vain. It is not wasted effort. As frustrating as it might seem, like if you are coming to the end of your life, you're wondering, did they accomplish something? If a church is 125 years old and it's wondering, is it done what it's supposed to do? Does it have a future? Know that it is not in vain if we are people of the resurrection. So I didn't get to write about it in the book, but my favorite expression of this comes from a former pastor of Salem Covenant. He died kind of while we were editing the book, so we dedicated it to him. In 1984, he had to do what I would suspect is the hardest thing a pastor would ever have to do. He had to bury his son. So his son Carl was, I think, 25 and died of multiple sclerosis. And this pastor in the summer of 1984 had to preach at the funeral of his own son. He was newly married, new seminary grad, and died. And he kind of acknowledged this. There's a sense of, was Carl's life wasted? It didn't mean anything. It seemed like it was snipped in its bud. It didn't get to grow anything. It just was wasted. He chose for his text Mark's version of the story of the woman who pours out nard, costly ointment, for the feet of Christ at Bethany. And if you remember the story, the disciples are scandalized by that. It's wasted, right? You've wasted all that. Judas said, we could have spent that money on the poor. And so as the sermon reached its end, here's what this pastor said. The good news I want to share with you is that nothing is wasted. Neither the precious ointment or the alabaster jar nor its brokenness. When all is said and done, everything in the long run depends on God's doing, where everything finally serves His purpose, gathering up the fragments in resurrection, so that nothing goes down the drain, so that nothing is lost. I mean, this would be powerful even if it hadn't been preached his own son funeral, but over the body of the son, it's just unbelievably powerful. So this was Glenn Weimer. I don't know if any of you knew. I actually mentioned him at a talk at Seattle Pacific, and I had 5 people come up and talk to me about Glenn. And if you didn't know him, let me just tell you a little bit about Glenn. Glenn's born in Kansas City, goes to North Park, actually goes to Yale, studies with Richard Niebuhr and a few others, and then serves Covenant churches the rest of his life. He edits our hymnal, and he came to Salem and retired there. So he's holding a copy of the original Pietist Rosenius had done. He wrote a column for a revived version of Pietist about hymns. And Glenn died last year. And so I was thinking a lot about, as we were editing the book, thinking a lot about that sermon and this notion of God gathers up all these fragments in the resurrection. But that's not just happening at the end. Like, God is always doing this. God is always resurrecting the church itself and the world through it. And the other famous passage that I think I might have used from Glenn was something he wrote for a denominational magazine a couple years before his son died. And it was about the resurrection. It was an Easter issue. And so Glenn had been reading an essay by E.B. White. You probably read it at some point. He was an essayist and editor. And his wife, Catherine, was a writer too. And Catherine was dying. She had terminal heart disease, if I remember right. And E.B. White watched her go out to the garden one October or November. It was a dismal kind of day, and she went out to plant tulip bulbs. I'm not a gardener at all, but my mom does this. Every fall she plants tulip bulbs, which will not then germinate until the spring, so you won't see them for months. And so Catherine White was doing this, knowing that she might never actually see the tulips. She was just planting the bulbs. And so E.B. White, in his famous description, said that she was plotting the resurrection. It was kind of a play on words. When you have a garden, you plot a garden, you plan where the things go, but you were also plotting in the sense that you were planning something. And she was, in a sense, planning a resurrection. This dying woman, right? And so Glenn then reflected on that. He said this. What a provocative phrase, plotting the resurrection. Catherine was a member of the resurrection conspiracy, the company of those who plant seeds of hope, seeds of tomorrow under dark skies of uncertainty and impending death. People going about their living and dying until no one knows how, when, or where the tender shoots of life appear and a small piece of creation is healed. That's who we are as God's Easter people, those oblivious to the ending of our own days, calmly plotting the resurrection. So I won't claim this just for pietism. I think all Christians ought to believe this, but I think it is somewhat distinctive. Pietists are a hopeful people, right? And it's because I think this is what we believe. The story of Christianity is not just about atonement and crucifixion, it's about an empty tomb. It's about God bringing life out of death. In our individual case, a dead church, a dead world. And so I guess that's my exhortation to you, even if you don't decide to come back for a second week, is please go forth and plot the resurrection because you are God's Easter people. Let me close this in prayer. Lord God, it's not Easter, it's summer. It's a time when we see all sorts of evidence of new life and growth, flowers and trees and corn and soybeans and all sorts of evidence of this. But there are times in our life, there are seasons when we don't see this, when it doesn't seem like anything new is growing, when anything green is shooting forth, and the earth is just dead, and skies are dark. And so wherever we are, whichever season we feel like we're living through in our life, in the life of this church, in the life of our society, and the world beyond it, remind us through relationships, through the past, through the sermon we're going to hear today, that we are a resurrection people, that we always have hope for better times, and that whatever we do is not in vain. So I thank you that you have called each and every one of us, gifted each and every one of us, to be doing things not just here on a Sunday morning, but throughout the week, in whatever circumstances we find ourselves, with whatever people, whatever neighbors we know. Help us to be those resurrection people plotting the resurrection. I pray this in Jesus' risen. Amen. All right, hope to see you back in a week.